Hello, welcome to the Heart of the Piano YouTube channel. I'm Bob Rose. Today I'm reviewing all the new ABRSM Syllabus books. This is for 2025 to 2026. Actually, this is a condensed version of a quite comprehensive review that I've put up on my podcast. Not everyone is going to know that I have a podcast. The podcast is also called Heart of the Piano. So I put reviews of things like examination board syllabuses and books, but also that's where I put all my content to do with generally the psychology of playing. I'm starting to put it on my YouTube channel, but if you're interested in the psychology of how to play well, I really recommend the podcast. And in fact, in recent episodes, I very strongly recommend the 5 key psychological skills that you need to master, that you need to know to basically be good. And I get all my students to listen to these episodes because they're things I bring up over and over and over again. They're like shortcuts, if you want to call them that, into just really good musicality. Anyway, so to try and cut a long story short and get on with it, because, oh my God, did I go down a lot of rabbit holes in the podcast review. So I'm going to try and keep it relatively short. And so basically, one of the most important things, everyone's always asking this, the old syllabus, the syllabus that's 2023-2024, you can keep using it until the end of 2025. You've got another year and a half when you can use those books and those pieces. The 2025 to 2026 books, you can only start using them from the beginning of 2025. And you can't mix and match them. You either use these books or you use the other books. You can obviously use one piece as your extra choice if you're doing the online exam, but basically you can't do half from one, half from the other. So anyway, a lot of the stuff that I say in my review, especially in the podcast review, not everyone's going to agree with it. It's a very personal take. And in general, these new books, I think they're going to be very controversial. They're going to be quite Marmite for people who know what Marmite is, who are British. So, you're going to love it or hate it. To kind of try and cut a long story short, the question I think that you want to ask yourself, if you're sort of wondering, am I going to like these new books? Do you believe that ABRSM exams should be predominantly classical pieces? Do you believe it's okay to be able to sit an ABRSM exam and potentially not play any classical pieces? Now, not every grade is like that. In fact, most grades don't quite go to that extreme, but that is now becoming a thing. And I have a problem with this. So this is really the main sticking point. Anyone who wants to discuss this, by the way, in the comments, please do. And I can see there are arguments for and against this, but personally, I'm going to put my flag in the ground and say this is not a good thing. I talk about this in a lot of detail in the podcast review, but that's basically my major observation with these new books. So basically what I did is I went back, I got the books basically 3 weeks before the launch, which was yesterday. Yesterday was the launch when you could go into the shops and buy the books. ABRSM were kind enough to send me all of the books in advance. This doesn't mean that I immediately say, oh, they're wonderful. And in fact, I'm usually pretty critical, and yet they still keep sending them to me because my impression is they're very good at taking on board criticism. So that's a really good thing. So yeah, basically I sight read through all the pieces in the old books and then sight read every single piece in the new books to get a sense of comparison, to really comprehensively get a feeling for what the new books were like. I also learned all of the grade 8 pieces because my intention was to have them all on YouTube yesterday with performances and tutorials. I'm run out of time. I've not been able to record them, but they will appear soon with full tutorials. So if you subscribe and you look back at past videos, you'll see loads of ABRSM performances and tutorials. There is already one List A piece that I have put up as a performance. There will be a tutorial soon, but if you subscribe and click on notification, you're going to find out every single time that I put tutorials up. My plan is to then go through all the grade 7 ones, the grade 6, the grade 5, and so on and so on. Now, I also have performances and tutorials for pieces that are already alternative list pieces. So do take a look, and I'll put a link below to where you can find all those resources. So, it's well worth checking out. So, in my opinion, it was worth, in the podcast review, spending a little bit of time talking about the wider context of current music education and the drive to decolonize classical music education. And I did make a very thorough review of the last Trinity syllabus, which basically all these books here, and again, Trinity were kind enough to send me all of these books. This is the most recent Trinity syllabus, and they're great. They're fantastic books. They have amazing pieces. They're really good value for money. Really nice pieces. But for the first time properly, there's so much non-classical music in these books. There's so much that you could do an entire grade in pretty much every single grade, just doing film music, or just doing pop music, or just doing jazz. And I argued at huge length in that Trinity review that, in my opinion, this really is not a good thing. And I'll leave links in the description below to where you can see those reviews if you're interested in hearing me chat about that. So I was really scared. Before I got these new ABRSM books, I had a feeling, oh God, I bet ABRSM are going to copy what Trinity are doing, because the fact is they will undoubtedly sell more books by doing this, because I'm sure that there's a lot of people who are going to be encouraged by the fact that they can take exams without having to play classical music. I'm sure they're going to sell more exams. And I was really scared that ABRSM were going to do this. Plus, there's the issue of the ABRSM's newly launched new diploma structures, and I'm just so appalled at what ABRSM have done with their diplomas by dumbing them down. And one of my most recent YouTube videos is a review about a webinar that they did about the dumbing down. They totally deny they've dumbed them down, but in my review I argue, I think very convincingly, no, I'm sorry, you guys have just obviously dumbed these down. So I was very scared what was going to happen to these books. But then I got them in the post. I immediately had a look at grade 8, grade 7, immediately had a look. And at first I was like, oh, thank God. They still seem pretty classical. They still seem pretty solid. They seem pretty good. And I was like, oh, what a relief. But pretty quickly, it became very, very obvious that in almost every single grade, except grade 7, kind of, but in pretty much every single other grade, List B now consists of at least one piece that is plainly and obviously not classical. Sometimes it's film music, sometimes it's pop, sometimes it's just really sugary, contemporary, non-classical, sometimes it's jazz, and sometimes you get a creep of jazz and non-classical into List A. So if you want to know more about, the history of what List A, List B, List C, go listen to my review. Again, the link to that review, to the podcast review, will be in the description below. I really encourage you to listen to it, because it's, I think, a really interesting discussion. And piano teachers and piano students, I think you're all going to have opinions about all of this stuff. So, just very quickly, List A used to be Baroque classical, List B was classical romantic, and List C was kind of everything else that was more modern. Well, now these List A, List B, List C, these differences seem to be kind of completely pointless. And given that now we have this erosion of needing to do classical music in these exams, this is very, very, very slippery. But anyway, I talk about this a lot in the review. So basically, I spent quite a while talking about, why did Trinity do this? Why did they feel the need to suddenly include so much non-classical music? And I presented, both in the Trinity review and to some extent in the latest ABRSM podcast review, evidence, quite strong evidence, for why this seems to be in the context of decolonizing of classical music, that there's a lot of what seem to be loud, influential voices in the music education community putting forward the argument that Western classical music is problematic because of its colonial history of male white composers, and that it's potentially quite racist, and that this should not be a core part of education in today's multicultural society. I completely disagree with this. And I completely disagree with this, and I talk about this a little bit in the podcast review. I'm not white. And when I grew up, this was a lot more obvious to people. I think as I get older and as Britain becomes more multicultural, it comes up very rarely. And occasionally these discussions come up and people say to me, I had no idea, Bob, that you weren't white. It just so rarely comes up these days. But when I was younger, it was really, really painfully obvious. This was very much a thing. And if I'm honest, it bothered me that in the world of classical music, it was just so obviously painfully white, and that non-white people just weren't represented. And it bothered me. Plus the fact that I didn't mention this in the review, but if you go to pretty much any classical music concert now, and you look around, how many non-white faces do you see there? And I bet you that 99% of concerts you go to, you won't see a single face that isn't white. It's very depressing. So in my opinion, it's very important to have very good representation of minorities, of women, because historically you've not seen many women composers represented, although there were quite a few. But yeah, I don't want to get drawn down the rabbit hole of this too much, because I do talk about this much more in the podcast review. But basically, in recent years, all the examination boards have made a really, really good job of starting to include more women and more composers of colour in ways that's probably way beyond the proportion of these composers that exist in reality. Because in reality, most composers have been and are white men. But nonetheless, this positive discrimination of seeing a high proportion of women and non-white composers, I think this is really good. Because, kids growing up, it's important for girls to see that women compose, and it's important to see non-white kids see that actually there are non-white people who compose. I think this is, really, really important. However, I personally am such a huge believer in the value of classical music and the tradition of classical music. And I do not think that this is a thing that also needs to be thrown out in the quest to decolonize and to have music that is more relevant for composers of color and for women. So anyway, this whole wider context, although a lot of it isn't talking about these books in particular, I do think it's important because I personally suspect that why we're starting to see suddenly so much more pop music, film music, jazz appearing the whole way through the books, not just in List C, but in now List B, sometimes List A. I think it's hot on the heels of Trinity, and I think that ABRSM are dipping their toe in the water of, do we actually need to radically decolonize and perhaps remove the need for classical music altogether? This is quite alarming for me. So now, in my opinion, it is not the same thing to have a qualification where we are appraising somebody's performance of, for example, a Bach Prelude and Fugue, a classical sonata, a piece of contemporary classical music, and to compare that performance at the same grade level with somebody who plays pop and film music. Jazz is maybe a little bit more in the middle, but in my opinion, these are not comparable. And again, I talk much more in the review. So before you basically, roast me in the comments and say, how dare you say these things, at least go listen to the podcast interview where I explain a little bit more why I believe that. Part of the reason I talk about what is classical music, and it's, it's interesting. There's this composer called Alexis French. He's a black composer who sort of writes in the style of Einaudi is the sort of thing that comes nearest to mind. It's a little better than Einaudi, but it's basically very sugary music, which some people would call classical, but I wouldn't call it classical. I would call it more like pop minimal. It's sort of it doesn't really exactly have a strong genre of its own, but it's not classical. It's minimalism. It's sort of pop minimalism is where I'd put it. Now, this guy Alexis French, he's actually the artistic director for ABRSM at the moment. And he presented a load of podcast episodes, and I really recommend that people listen to those. One of those podcast episodes, and I listen to it on Spotify, but I'm sure you can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. So one podcast episode is classical music, and he spends the episode sort of basically discussing with someone, what is classical music? Is that even a useful genre? How useful is it to call things classical? And he makes the point that maybe it's all a little bit restrictive. Now, in that kind of in the context of that, for me, what is classical music for me personally? Well, again, there's always going to be outliers, there's always going to be exceptions to this, but generally classical music, for me, generally, are things that have a little bit more sophisticated structure. So if you have a melody, the melody develops. Not always, but there's just a little bit more of a sophisticated, this turns into that, which turns into this, which develops into this. Whereas things like film music sometimes doesn't develop at all. You just get a tune, you get the next bit of the tune, you go back to the tune, you get the next bit of tune, and that's it. Pop music is like that. You've got verse, chorus, guitar solo, if you're lucky, because I love guitar solos. I'm an electric guitarist. But basically, it doesn't have this more kind of intricate sense of structure. Now, that's fine. I'm not saying that structure is better. It's just a thing that classical music has. Something else that, in my opinion, mostly classical music has is that you have many layers. So things that aren't classical music tend to have a tune and a bass line, maybe, and a harmony. So if you look at a lead sheet or a fake book, that kind of thing, you see the melody and you see the chord symbols, and that sort of quite neatly sums up what a lot of non-classical music is. Classical music generally, because any composer who trains in classical music right from the beginning, you're trained to start thinking about counter melodies, counterpoints, different textures. You think much more horizontally. Now, if you're playing a piece of classical music, generally, almost all of the time, you have to figure out how to make that structure feel a lot more organic. How do you communicate the structure as you go from this bit into this bit? How do you make the whole thing hang together? How do you communicate, and how do you listen to all the different counterpoints? How do you follow all the layers underneath? So, if you're comparing someone playing Bach, Beethoven, whatever, Chopin to some degree, and you're comparing that with someone playing film music or pop music that generally has nowhere near those amounts of things, it's just not the same. And there's another thing as well, which is that, unless you live in a cave, everyone is exposed to pop music, to some degree jazz, and film music. You turn on the TV and there's film music, there's TV music, there's pop music. So if you're examining someone's ability to play and to emotionally interpret music of the moment, that's nowhere near as interesting a challenge, as interesting an appraisal of their skill in testing them on music that was basically written hundreds of years ago or even 100 years ago. Music education of classical music, one of the points to educate people in classical music is not just how to play it, but maybe how to appreciate it, in how to listen to it, how to love it. And so, this is the thing that the more people that don't learn classical music, that aren't exposed to it, the more that classical music is going to die. And, I speak as someone who, I am a rock and heavy metal electric guitarist. I want to make that super clear. I play rock and metal and jazz and blues, and I do teach all those styles, and I love things that aren't classical, but I also passionately love classical music. And I don't think that I would have if I hadn't had an education in classical music, because it's just that little bit more sophisticated. It takes more of an education to appreciate all the depth in it. Or, you don't have to have that. There's a lot of people who love classical music who've never, had any lessons in it. But on the whole, the more education you have as a generalization, the more you can appreciate it and feel it more deeply. Not every single time, but usually. One of the points that I make in the review is it's a little bit like, well, why do we study anything in schools? Because some people are arguing, why should we make anyone do classical music? And by the way, I don't believe for a moment we should make anyone do classical music. I just think we give them the option, you introduce them to it, and if they really don't want to do it, then yeah, don't do it. But that option has to be there, in my opinion. So anyway, as I was saying, one of the sort of analogies that I was drawing, why do we learn anything in school that we kind of don't really want to learn, that doesn't have an immediate gratification for us? Why do we learn about Shakespeare? Why do we learn any English literature? Why do we learn anything at all? Because at some point, it's not just to be good at things. I don't believe that's why school education exists. At some point, some educators and some people who were passionate about their subjects felt so passionately that they thought, this is something that will enrich the lives of kids who learn this. And that will be the case with Shakespeare. I don't believe that people teach Shakespeare in schools because this is a life skill that people need, or even because it makes the English language somehow more skilled in the people who learn it, but because there's genuine cultural value in being exposed to the psychological depth that you get in Shakespeare plays. It's deep and enjoyable. And it's exposing people to be able to enjoy it who otherwise wouldn't have, because let's face it, for most people, if they've never encountered Shakespeare and then sat down and watched the Shakespeare play, it would probably go completely over their heads and just be too much to absorb. And so for me, this is what classical music is. A lot of the time, it has a higher level of sophistication, which needs a bit of education. Now, I'm not saying that it is better than other music, because if it was, I wouldn't play electric guitar and I wouldn't play rock music. They all serve a function. And so one of the analogies that I use all the time is it's like if you're learning about architecture or interested in architecture, cathedrals are unbelievably amazing works of art. But that doesn't mean that I want to live in a cathedral. Everything has its use. Everything has its context. So, yeah, anyway, moving on from that, in my review, I do kind of bring up maybe if we want to encourage people to be able to study and have exams with things that feature film music, pop music, rock music, maybe we should have different exams for all of that stuff. Like at the moment, I'm reviewing the LCM exams for electronic keyboard. And again, stay tuned for my reviews of that. And yeah, I talk about it in a little bit more detail in the podcast review for these books. But basically, that's brilliant because they let you improvise. And this is something that, I do bring up in my review. If you're going to allow people to take these ABRSM and Trinity exams, not touching classical music and opening up pop and rock and film music and all these different kinds of styles, I don't really get the point in this format, forcing people to read them in written notation, especially grades 5 and below grade 5. This isn't how people make music. If they're like 99% of pop musicians are not reading the dots on the page, they're not reading the sheet music. So why don't we have exams if we really want to promote rock and pop music? Make exams for people where they're improvising and where their understanding of harmony and chords is that they play it without having to read every single note on the page. So something similar to what ABRSM do with their jazz exams at grades 1 to 5. By the way, I did forget to mention in my review for ABRSM for the new books, but I'm also reviewing the new LCM grades initial to grade 8 jazz piano. And that's very valuable because obviously ABRSM only do them to grade 5. LCM do them all the way through to grade 8 and diploma level. So I'm going to be reviewing those as well. So stay tuned for that. Now, Go do those. Go do those rather than suddenly make it possible to do, these normal, what have been traditionally classical exams, doing jazz and rock and pop. Make different exams for all of that. Anyway, so I talk about all of this at huge length in my review. Now, I do also acknowledge that obviously ABRSM have a very difficult set of choices on their hands at the moment. It's a difficult balance. So everything that I'm saying now and in my way more detailed review, which I obviously, do recommend that you go listen to, it's a difficult balance, and there's a lot of different voices making their opinions known. So anyway, having a look at these actual pieces, yes, it is possible in the occasional grade that you actually could take the whole exam without touching a single classical piece. But for the most part, you can't. So, and in grade 7, I'd say is like the most classical out of all of them. I'd argue that the piece that they've put in, the Ginastera, that is obviously supposed to be the List B piece that is kind of more bluesy, that's not really classical. To my ear, it's still really solidly classical, and it's still quite rigorously classical. So grade 7 out of all of them is the one where it's difficult to have List A and List B pieces that aren't classical. There is one piece in the new alternative list for grade 7, which is in List B, which is a jazz, well-tempered jazz prelude. So you've got one piece out of the I can't remember off the top of my head, 20 or so pieces that you choose from for List B, and there's one in the alternative list where you could do a jazz piece, meaning that if you did your online exam with 4 pieces, it's possible, if you're determined enough, to make 3 of those pieces jazz. But overwhelmingly, most of the pieces in most of the books are still classical. So they haven't fully gone down the Trinity road yet. But every other grade book has at least 1 or 2 in the core books List B piece, which to me feels dumbed down and non-classical. Because like I sort of argued before, for various reasons, structure, counterpoint, all these kinds of things, and the fact that they're more in the musical vernacular of the now, they're just kind of easier for people to play. So this greatly bothers me that some people will be taking these exams who are want to be taken seriously, that they've got a classical qualification, and at the same time it will have been possible for some people to take these with mostly non-classical, and in a couple of grades no classical at all. I'm pretty shocked and appalled by this, and I suspect a lot of people out there might also be quite shocked and appalled by this. But if you're a student and you buy into the ABRSM brand, the pieces are fun. They're enjoyable. They're a good, solid selection of pieces. So, there is that. So I also make the point that if ABRSM are going to follow in Trinity's footsteps and not just dip their toe in, but fully commit to this road where they are completely abandoning List. To me, it seems like they have already pretty much just completely abandoned List A, List B, List C. In my mind, the List A, List B, List C, the forcing of making people, forcing for want of a better word, the forcing of making people to be balanced musicians by having classical, baroque, romantic. That's what made ABRSM exams so desirable. I still have this a lot at the moment, that when I ask people, why are you doing ABRSM rather than Trinity? They'll be like, but Trinity's easier. It's the easy option. It's the get out option. It's just more dumbed down. And I think one of the huge reasons for this traditionally is that ABRSM made you have List A, List B, List C. Now, if ABRSM suddenly follow Trinity down the road of let's not make people do classical music at all, what is it then that separates ABRSM from the Trinity syllabus and these Trinity books? Because I've got to say, the Trinity syllabus is excellent. They have such a good selection of pieces. With each increasing syllabus that comes out, I'm more and more impressed by their editing, by the choices of the pieces, by the copyrights that they managed to get, their choice of pop music and jazz and contemporary. It's outstanding. It's so good. ABRSM are not going to be able to compete with that, and especially when they only have 9 pieces in each book. Trinity are going to blow them out of the water. In my opinion, ABRSM need to focus on what traditionally has made them stronger than Trinity. And at the moment, I'm alarmed that they're just following Trinity. So just do Trinity. Having said that, having said all of that, for the moment, they're still reasonably solidly classical, but by allowing to most of the grades only have to do one classical piece, suddenly, well, why do ABRSM exams at all? So, that's a massive concern for me. And every 2 years when I review the new ABRSM syllabuses that come out, I'm generally always very critical about the editing. The editing every single time just seems generally quite slapdash. You can look at previous reviews for examples of this. But basically, there are almost always just terrible rhythm layouts that you look at it and you have to sort of really work out what rhythm is that. It's just so badly laid out. I'm generally really not a fan of the fingerings. I generally disagree with ornamentation suggestions. There's always huge amounts of misprints. And in the one 2 years ago, I had to put up misprints that I had spotted in like so many of the books that I told them. I actually contacted ABRSM and told them the misprints, which even now they still have not fixed and corrected on the website, which every single month I see people keep asking the same questions on Facebook groups, asking, is this a misprint? Yeah. Now, this time round, oh my God, for the first time, they're on it. The editing is flawless. Beautiful editing, very easy to read, great typesetting, with very few exceptions. All the fingerings are like, yeah, that's really solid fingering suggestions. That I've almost found no misprints. I'm pretty good at spotting them, and it's just excellent quality this year. I'm absolutely blown away. So that's great. And also, one of my previous criticisms was that in the higher grades, Baroque and classical music was so highly editorialized, with extra slurs and dynamics and, all the stuff that wasn't in the original manuscript. But now, in all the higher grades, it's very urtext. And if that doesn't mean anything, then it's probably not important to you. But for teachers and for people who are a little bit more serious about Baroque and classical at the higher grades, urtext is really quite a big deal. And, well done to ABRSM for that. And in the lower grades, where they do editorialize Baroque and early classical with various sort of extra things to help beginners, which I think is a good thing, it's so highly detailed at the bottom of the page. It's very rigorously academic for teachers and for people who actually want to know, well, what is editorialized here and what was in the original. It's outstanding. It's just absolutely excellent editing this year. So absolutely well done, ABRSM. Absolutely excellent. Now, one of my biggest problems with the new syllabus, so like I said before, I went straight to grade 8, mainly because most of my students at the moment are at the higher end. I've not only sort of grades 8, grades 5 to 8, but also diploma level students. So grade 8, what happened to it this year? There's barely anything here. So, a few years ago, I think sort of 3 syllabuses ago, it was a very thick book that you got for grade 8. Off the top of my head, I think you had 12 pieces in there. And each piece, you had a healthy amount of pages. They were quite long. And so over the years, the books just got thinner and thinner and thinner. And then suddenly this year, you've got way less pages than last year. I forget the exact amount. I do actually tell you the amount of pages in the podcast review. But there's almost nothing here. So the pieces are just getting shorter and shorter. You've got the girl with the flaxen hair, which is 2 pages. And in general, the grade 8, I feel, is a little bit dumbed down from last year. It doesn't feel quite as difficult on a high level as last year, but also, instead of a full, quite meaty first movement of a Mozart sonata that you had last year, now you've got Rondo à la Turque. And I'm sure a lot of people will love Rondo à la Turque. And, this was something I noticed in the latest Trinity syllabus, which was that they had a lot of very famous, iconic pieces, as well as more obscure stuff. I think because it's going to be popular, it's going to hook people. Now, with ABRSM, one of their biggest strengths has always been that they go for more obscure pieces. And I think it makes it nicer for teachers as well to not have to go, oh, God, this piece again. Yeah, because, generally if someone wants to learn Rondo à la Turque, it's generally better value for money to go have a book with Rondo à la Turque in it than use up what can be sort of, they're not cheap, these ABRSM books, and to basically fill these books with pieces that most piano teachers and a lot of piano students are already going to have. So, when I looked at this and we've got, okay, Mozart Rondo à la Turque, Debussy Girl with the Flaxen Hair, Scott Joplin Maple Leaf Rag, oh my God. Don't get me wrong, people are going to love Maple Leaf Rag. It's such a popular piece. But like I said in my podcast review, I think I'm speaking for a lot of teachers when I say we're all going to go, oh my God, not Maple Leaf Rag. But I don't think that's a worthy follow-up piece to the Over the Bars from last year, which I really enjoyed, and which is one of my most watched videos. But anyway. So, I mean, go listen to my review. And by the way, there is a part 2 of the podcast review as well, where I actually talk about every single grade in a little bit more detail. And I give you timestamps in the show notes if you're interested in one particular grade. So basically go off and listen to that. So in a nutshell, what do I think about these books? For anyone who's predominantly interested in classical music, and that's if you are a teacher or if you're a student who basically wants to take a qualification that you believe is reflective that you have achieved a classical qualification which is going to be more impressive than someone who has taken that qualification playing film music, playing jazz, then you probably don't want to take ABRSM anymore. You're definitely not going to want to take Trinity. You're certainly not going to want to take Rock School Classical for reasons I go into in that review. But LCM exams are now the only solid exam board that do a great job with classical, and I recommend to go listen to my review of that. Again, all the links are going to be in the show notes, but LCM are just doing such a brilliant job, not just with classical, but I love their electronic keyboard syllabus, and there's going to be reviews and examples of me playing from those books. And they also do superb jazz books as well, jazz exams. They're just the leaders, I think, across all the exams now, but Trinity have the edge now in just sheer value for money. The amount of pieces you get in those books and such a rich variety of pieces. ABRSM are still a brand. There's still a lot of people who are probably going to be loyal to ABRSM. And for people who are not super serious classical people, I'd say most of my adult students are going to fall into that camp. They're never going to want to be professional classical musicians. I'm going to guess most of my adult students don't really care so much about exactly what their exam results represents to them. It's just more something to motivate them and something to aim towards. And for a huge amount of kids who just basically like the ABRSM brand, it's a really solid selection of pieces, and they're very well edited. And so, that is what I think about them in a nutshell. So, if you disagree with any of the things that I said in this particular review, please do leave comments in the description below. But also, do go and listen to the longer review that is on the podcast. By all means, leave the comments, but don't be surprised if sometimes I might say, did you listen to the full review? Because I actually did answer that particular comment that you made. I talked about that a little bit more in depth in the podcast review. But if you want to discuss it more, yeah, let's chat about it below, because I think there's so much here to talk about. But anyway, I hope that was useful for you. Let me know what your thoughts are on this. Should we be able to take these exams without any classical music in them? This is really the burning question. So anyway, take care. Go watch more of my other videos. And also, I should mention very, very quickly, I do have space in my studio for more students. I teach online. And if you're interested, details will be in the description below how to get in touch with me. Again, I have so many tutorials on YouTube, so you can watch some of those to get an idea for how I teach. Again, listen to my podcast episodes for a little bit more about the psychological approach. But anyway, go watch some of my videos, go listen to my podcast episodes, or go do some practice, and do subscribe to find out when I release more resources. And I'll see you for the next video or podcast episode. So take care and goodbye.